Hi, everybody. Good evening. Welcome to the broadcast. This is a broadcast that I think is very meaningful to me, family of origin. I chose it because it came off of just running two back-to-back intensives. And then prior to that, running a couple of group intensives. And what was thinking about when I was planning this was it doesn't matter who I meet within a family, whether it's a parent and a child, whether it's an individual or a group of individuals, it comes back to that same idea, that same lesson, that same discovery, and that is the family of origin. What was it like where we grew up? What were the messages, the themes, the roles, the ideas that were implanted into us, most often not explicitly, but what were the ideas that were implanted in us that affect our daily lives? So that's what we're going to be talking about tonight is how our family of origin and the family that we're raising right now in family systems theory is called the family of procreation, how our family of origin impacts us day to day, how we carry that around. Now, many of us spend a lot of time and energy trying not to repeat the messages, the ideas, the behaviors of our parents, of our family of origin, but there are still some ways in which those messages seep through and seep into our daily relationships. So I'm going to talk about a series of quotes. This first quote that I'm going to share with you, for me, it creates the umbrella for all the rest of what we're going to talk about this evening. It really is this powerful, and I don't think it's too strong of a statement about mental health and about what our project is and looking at the problems the challenges that we have today. It's from the book the Drama of the Gifted Child from Alice Miller, and it comes from page 1 where she says, "Experience has taught us that we have only one enduring weapon in our struggle against mental illness, and that is the emotional discovery of the truth about the unique history of our childhood." So it is at going back and looking at our childhood that we really find all of the keys to the challenges that we have today, to the difficulties that we have today. One of the things that I'm proud of and my team is they're doing a good job. A lot of people come to us and want to do a family intensive, which can be really, really wonderful. And one of the things that I'm encouraging them to do, and we've had success with lately, is encouraging the parents to come to their own intensive first to create that base or that foundation of their own work, especially in families where that's not been established, to create that base so that when we work on the child and the child's issues, the parent can then refer back to their own childhood, their own inner child, their own wounds that they carry around. I say this next quote. This is from me. It's supposed to be funny, but I think there's a lot of truth in it also. When a new client tells me about their ideal childhood, I tell them therapy can fix that. And if you've had a lot of therapy, that quote needs no explanation. If you've had little to no therapy, what that can sound like is the therapist giving the individual, the parent, permission to blame somebody else. And it's not that at all. If you've been in therapy, you realize that as awareness increases, so does accountability. The more aware we become of the wounds and the legacy that we carry in our lives, that we carry from previous generations, the more accountability there is to try to do something different, to try to bring ourselves and our children out of that legacy, out of that lineage. I love this quote because it speaks to this unconscious process that I've alluded to already this evening. It's from Tion Dayton in her book, Emotional Sobriety. She says, "Our children don't become who we tell them to be, they become who we are." As a therapist, I need no convincing that children live in the affective space between their parents. They live in their unspoken and sometimes unfelt emotional world. Much of parenting is implicit rather than explicit, which is why children become who we are rather than who we tell them to be. Our children drink us up like little sponges. We are showing them who we want them to become. Most importantly, I will say this as clearly and emphatically as I can. Most importantly, the messages that we pass on are about emotional proximity. And what I mean by my emotional proximity is boundaries, where you stop and where I start. And that can sound like a very theoretical, heady idea. Essentially, the kind of boundaries I'm talking about are this: is what you think and what you feel about me or about you. Do I take responsibility for what you think and feel? Or am I sensitive and aware and open to what you think and feel, but not necessarily pushed and pulled by it? So it's that idea of, do I need to take care of your anxiety, your frustration, your anger, your disappointment as a parent? Same in spousal relationships or partner relationships. Are you responsible for what the other person thinks and feels? Now, when I ask that and I talk about differentiation, the healthy version of that is not to be cold and uncaring and unempathic at all. In fact, differentiation absolutely leads to empathy. In fact, it's impossible without it. It leads to empathy and compassion, because empathy and compassion are built upon the idea of having an independent self, of being able to truly see the other person. So when we become reactive or dependent on someone else, we've lost our emotional proximity. When we see and hear other person, there's an idea in enlightenment that talks about that an enlightened person doesn't see somebody else's actions, feelings, behaviors, or statements as something about them, but rather they see it as a condition of the person who's expressing them. And so when we have our reactions, our triggers, our defenses, that's not connectedness. That's a lack of differentiation. So when Dr. Dayton talks about this, it is that we pass on: emotional proximity. And that's why we spent so much time and energy at Evoke at getting both your child and you to develop this idea of differentiation, of separateness. It's called healthy detachment. And I state all the time that healthy detachment and healthy attachment are the same thing. So when your child writes an impact letter to you, that's a practice for both of you, maybe most importantly for you, in differentiation. I want to understand and hear about my child's internal world. And it may or may not be about me. I will try that on myself. But to become reactive, defensive, justifying, intensely apologetic, anxious, all of those things demonstrate a lack of separate self. So that's the one thing that we pass on. So when somebody says you marry your mother or you marry your father, while that person on the outside might look and seem very different, they share something with our parents, and that is emotional proximity. And there are almost no exceptions to this. If you can think about emotional proximity on a scale from 0 to 100, right? 0 being absolutely fused, absolutely enmeshed, absolutely reactive or dependent. Those are kind of other sides of the same coin. That's a 0 on the scale. And then we think of 100 as somebody that's completely enlightened, like Yoda. I'll use Yoda, the fictitious character from Star Wars, who has absolute compassion and love and gentleness to him, but is completely separate, not dependent or reactive to others. That's 100 on this scale. If you grow up in a family that is a 55, every child in that family, by the time they leave, are going to be somewhere between a 50 and a 60, right? And when you go out in the world, if you're a 60, you're going to hang out with and get along with anyone from 55 to 65. Because if you're a 60, 90s won't make any sense to you. 90s will seem confusing, uncaring, cold, distant, incapable of intimacy. Whereas if you're 60, a 30 will feel reactive, immature, defensive, dramatic, chaotic, histrionic, right? And so 60s only can get along with somewhere, and the cutoff is arbitrary, but somewhere between 55 and 65. That's who we hang out with. And through a lot of therapy, through a deep amount of therapy, through a new context, a new relationship that ideally is fundamentally different from our family of origin, we can move away from or up the scale. Right? We go to 12-step meetings, to Al-Anon meetings, to codependency, and we realize that the truth of the slogans, what others think about me is none of my business. Stay on my side of the street. Right? We learn those kinds of things. And we upload, as it were, new software to combat the hardwiring. And we talk ourselves through new kinds of relationships. Parents learn to hang up on children who are abusing them. Parents learn to say no, and that's a complete sentence. Parents learn to stay empathic and connected when setting difficult boundaries. Parents learn healthy self-care. Spouses learn to include some space in their togetherness, some separateness in their togetherness. All of that happens as we do deep and powerful work as we grow up in this process. I love this quote from Daniel Siegel because it talks about the difference between the quality of your childhood and the meaning that you make out of it. It's from his book, Parenting from the Inside Out. Research in the field of child development, he says, has demonstrated that a child's security of attachment to its parents is very strongly connected to the parents' understanding of their own early life experiences. Again, it's the discovery of our unique emotional experience as children that makes all the difference. That our children's attachment to us will be influenced by what happened to us when we were young if we do not come to process and understand those experiences. So you can have what researchers and theorists call earned attachment. You might not have had a safe and traumatic-free or low-traumatic childhood. You may have had an enmeshed, right, an overly identified, overly anxious parent and child of family of origin experience. But if you do work, you can start to develop the ability to develop healthy attachments with your children, not replicating the patterns. So it's the context, right? The context shape us. I'm not going to get into a discussion in this broadcast about nature versus nurture. Right? It's a given that what we come with naturally, organically, right? What our organicity is. That is our brain, our nervous system, right? Our bodies. That there's a given to that we can't escape. But since we're all born and there's nothing we can do about the given, we're going to discuss the made, right? There's always a given and a made, and we're going to discuss the made. That's the only thing over which we have control. Understanding the given, learning differences, processing issues, right? IQ, those kinds of things can help offer us compassion and understanding for others. But essentially, the most important work that we can do is to focus on what happened to us and then how we behave in relationship to others, to our children. So our context shapes us, right? We fit, as it were, into the square holes of our family of origin. And then we go out in the world looking for square holes. We fit in those contexts that at some fundamental level were like those of our family of origin. And for many of us, we seek one that looks different, but end up finding on that base fundamental level, that same level of separateness, of emotional proximity, what family systems therapists call differentiation. How do we come to see our context? By getting out of them. The way that I talk about it and teach is through therapy, right? The therapist is not supposed to be a mother or a father. The therapist ideally is supposed to be somebody else, a different kind of a context. And I'll talk more about that. I love the story of Superman because I love the idea of identifying with the superhero inside of myself, right? The person with limitless ceilings, with limitless, boundless potentials. So I love that idea. But one of the things that I love most about the kryptonite myth is the idea of kryptonite. What is kryptonite? Kryptonite is a radioactive piece of Superman's home planet. So while he may be able to leap tall buildings in a single bound and stop trains, and bullets just bounce off of him, right? We all go out into the world. Most of us go out into the world with our friends or our careers or what we do. We find ourselves to be incredibly capable. And then we spend some time with our mothers or our fathers or our siblings. And we experience that regressive experience, or it could be cousins even, or grandparents or uncles and aunts. And we have that regressive experience, right? It's only in the presence of our home planet. The kryptonite becomes a metaphor for Mother Earth, Mother Planet, Mother Krypton. And it's in the presence of that we become reduced to this young, helpless, insecure, not well-behaving child. So that's what that myth is about. It's part of what that myth is about. We experience regression. I love this idea. I was using this idea, searching for something other than Superman to kind of illustrate this idea. And it's like working with parents when I do parent coaching, on the parent phone calls that we have with our parents, sometimes at the intensives. And then at the end of the intensives, the worst thing happens. We send you home, right? At the end of Evoke, wilderness therapy, we send the child on. That's the worst thing that we do. And the world doesn't have those same kinds of contexts and safety as do wilderness and as do the intensive experience. So we send you back out into the real world. And then it becomes difficult. Mike Tyson said this. For those of you who don't know, he was a very ferocious heavyweight champion in boxing for several years. And he said, with regard to boxing, he said, everybody has a plan until they get punched in the mouth. Everybody has a plan until they get punched in the mouth. If you've ever been in a fight as a kid, you know exactly what that feels like. If you've boxed or been in a striking sport like karate or martial arts, you know exactly what he's talking about. You have a plan until you get punched in the mouth. And so you can be clear, but you get on the phone with your child. You have that moment where he or she calls desperate. You walk out of the therapy session with your therapist as clear, as grounded, as fearless as can be. You walk back into your home where your spouse is, and you try to share that truth that you've been working on for that hour in therapy, and it's frightening. It's terrifying. It's easy to lose yourself in the gravitational pull of the person that you love and care about. And that's why we do a lot of inner child work at our intensives. What does that 5-year-old, 6-year-old, 7-year-old, 8-year-old self feel? What was it like for us? When we do those kinds of exercises at our intensives, we ask you to imagine, to go back in time and to visit your 5, 6, 7, 8-year-old self and ask them what they were feeling, what they were afraid of, how they were hurting. What we find is those answers, those themes are present today in all of us. And that many times we're trying to ward off those wounds that have already happened to us in our past, right? We're trying to prevent something that already happened to us, often in the life of our children. So this idea of the gravitational pull of the other is this idea of old contexts and how they come up. Some of you may have seen or like the old comedy, the old movie Fletch with Chevy Chase, starring Chevy Chase. And there's a line in there, a famous line, where he says it's all ball bearings these days. It's all family of origin. It's all codependency. Whether I'm treating heroin addiction or cutting or depression or anxiety, right? I'm looking at family of origin. I'm looking at codependency. I'm looking at the emotional proximity that a person carries around with them, that template that they carry around with them into all of their relationships. I love this quote by Ram Dass. If you think you're enlightened, go spend a week with your family. Sometimes I've had students say to me, I get along with everybody else except for my family, my parents. And what I say to them playfully, if they're in a playful mood, is I say, well, of course, that's easy. Getting along with friends, for the most part, is easy. If you're not getting along with friends, then something's really serious is going on. Because with friends, you get to go home. Right? With friends, it's limited exposure. And once you're bothered or annoyed, you get to leave. And you both go to separate homes. But with family of origin or family of procreation, you don't get to walk away. Any of you ever spend an excessive amount of time with a friend that you have never done before? Go on a vacation, right? Or when you're a little kid, you spend the night at somebody's house or they at your house, and after about a day, you're tired of them, right? Because those things, those feelings, those interactions that you're able to kind of contain in short spurts become very difficult. So family of origin, family of procreation, family is the only real measure, the only real accurate measure of our mental health. Everything else can be a bit of a facade. That's what makes marriage so difficult, is we fall in love, we get married, and then we get to learn, we get to meet and get to learn about the other person and they about us. I love this quote in talking about context. This is the idea, again, of the context that we grew up in, from David Foster Wallace. There are these two young fish swimming along, and they happen to meet an older fish swimming the other way, who nods at them and says, "Morning, boys, how's the water?" And the two young fish swim on for a bit, and then eventually one of them looks at the other and says, "What the hell is water?" We don't know our context when we're in it. It's only when we get out of it. Sometimes you can do that through travel, right? Going to different countries helps you to see your context. That's what I loved about Princess Di, is she took her children, the princes, into less affluent, war-torn countries, visiting really poor countries and people, and they learned something that they wouldn't have learned if they just stayed in the palace all of the time. And I thought that was very powerful. So sometimes travel can do it. For me, meeting other kind of people, and specifically sitting in therapy. Therapy, folks, I'm a therapist. I have a doctoral degree. I've read a lot of books, especially around parenting and the parent and child relationship. A lot of books. I've spent my life reading and studying it for the last 30 years. That's not what makes the difference in my life day to day. That's not what contributes to anything that I have of worth in my relationships, or a very, very small percentage. What makes the biggest difference is that hour a week that I spend with my therapist for the last 20 years. That's what makes the big difference. It's that context. It's not just the information. Many of our clients come from homes where parents replayed the way that they had been treated as children. These parents, unaware of their own context, pass on this legacy by requiring their children to conform to a way of being that they find tolerable. It may be seen the children from each of these homes emerges with a different base of experience in terms of which to experience, interpret, and cope with the world in which he or she functions. Clearly, topical solutions do not impact such a base. This is from Jamie Gill. Therefore, therapy should be a new experience. Therapy attempts to repair the self. This is not a behavioral program, right? We treat substance abuse disorder, but that's not really what we're looking at and dealing with daily. Most often we're dealing with trauma and codependency. Codependency in the addict themselves, right? The reason that an addict uses, the reason that somebody cuts on themselves, the reason that somebody avoids social contact is to quiet the voices in their head, right? the ingestion of chemicals automatically, consistently quiet those voices inside of the head. So in therapy, you listen to those voices, you bring them out, you find out where they came from. And sadly, difficultly, you begin to understand that a lot of those messages came from the culture and from our peers and from our teachers. And many of them also came from our parents, who unknowingly passed on this anxiety, this worry to their children. And they called it love. What's the experience of therapy? We take small risks at showing up in therapy, little by little, at the risk that what has happened in countless and powerfully formative contexts, primarily our family of origin experiences and preconscious and preverbal stages, we show up taking the risk that those things might happen again. And when that same reaction doesn't occur, in the cases where we find an adequate therapist, we slowly learn to trust that we can be our authentic selves without the risk of rejection or psychological annihilation. When we start to learn that who we are, what we feel, what we think is okay, because we sit in a room where somebody who's experiencing us doesn't shudder, doesn't wring their hands, doesn't gasp, doesn't fire us, doesn't get angry or disappointed or frustrated, but rather seeks to understand. When we have that experience, we then internalize that person, right? We place a copy of that person inside of us. And we combat the experiences of our childhood growing up. Part of the business, Gil says, of psychotherapy is to discover and create alternative experiences for thoughts, feelings, attitudes, and beliefs. This is undertaken in the service of freeing people to be able to re-experience themselves in a safe but different context. The virtue of talking to an empathic and accepting person who has a different base is that it quickly illuminates one's own. What was automatic and unconscious is noticed and discussed. The world is allowed to become one of noticeable constructions, right? We start to learn that the truth of our childhood is not the truth. We start to learn that the truth of our childhood is very unique to our childhood. And that there's a limitless, an infinite number of truths out there. Right? The way that we were told to be, how to deal with anger, sadness, pain, conflict is not the truth. It was just our family's truth. And experiencing new contexts help with that. I love this. The experience of seeing one's base from a different perspective, Gil says, can be profound. One way this happens is by allowing ourselves to be honest and open with someone who does not react the way our parents did. For example, what was very bad at home is now nothing. This difference in experience allows for the realization that things could be different. One's assigned position in one's past is not necessarily one's assigned position in the universe. So powerful. So profound. What was very bad at home is now nothing. And that our assigned position in our family is not necessarily our assigned position in the universe. So, those are some quotes and concepts for some foundation, for some background. Let's go over some bullet by bullet ideas. We all have stressors and trauma in our life, big and small, chronic and specific to a time. We all have that, more or less. And what we find, whether that's death, illness, loss of a job, learning disability that we're born with, a divorce, family addictions, all of that is present and in varying degrees and a lot more. But there are moderating effects. The research shows that there are things that can impact how those traumas impact us. The flexibility and clarity of roles in the family can mitigate or moderate those traumas. The congruency between overt and covert messages, right? That what is spoken is consistent with what is unspoken. Those can make a difference. The differentiation, right? This emotional proximity, the ability to be close and intimate without the need to sacrifice self. Those can make a difference. The ability to have somebody, to have a parent, at least one, doesn't even have to be a parent, to have one person in our lives consistent who sees us clearly and shows up as a self is the number one factor to mitigate or moderate trauma. The person who demonstrates these concepts that I'm listing here, differentiation, healthy roles, consistent communication, right? When we have somebody in our lives, ideally it's a parent, ideally it's two parents, but just to give some hope, it can be one parent. For me, one person that did that was my 6th grade teacher. Another person who did that was my uncle. They did it in ways and at times when my parents couldn't. It wasn't perfect, but it made a difference. I've shared before that I'm still in contact with my 6th grade teacher to this day because of that profound base that he saw me, and that in his eyes, and he knew of all of my screw-ups, but in his eyes, I was still okay. So all of this helps us to develop a self, a healthy self, and a place for belonging, healthy connection, right? It's an experience of attachment, of healthy attachment. There are 4 basic patterns that develop in families where there's a lot of stress and few emotional resources. Marital conflict is one place, obviously. Dysfunction in one spouse is another. This is from the research. And impairment in one or more children, right? The children in systems theory, your child's symptom can be the marker for family dysfunction, right? The lightning rod. It can be the identified spot, the point of entry for a therapist in, right? We accept the premise of struggling children as a part of Evoke. And then we start, what do we do with you? The same thing that every program does with you. We start talking about communication. Every program in the world of any kind of quality start talking about communication and listening. They start talking about unfelt or unexpressed feelings. They start to talk about unexplored beliefs that a person carries around with them and where they learned that, right? All the things that you're experiencing become a part of the process. Now, do we treat for example, substance use disorder directly? Of course. Do we treat depression and anxiety, eating disorders? Of course. But not on the surface. We treat it at the base, at the foundation. See, think of it this way. For those of you who are listening and not watching, I'm using my hands to illustrate, there's a large group of issues, of things that we need to work on and do, right? To be healthy. Most people think of this small area of our symptomology. I'm using substance abuse disorder because it's the simplest one to kind of point out, but don't do drugs. Don't cut on yourself, right? Don't isolate. We think of the don'ts. Don't rage and become violent. We think of the don'ts, and we talk about the don'ts. We diagnose the don'ts. We make lists of skills and tools to replace the don'ts. But really, if we work on this larger group of issues, which are mostly about the things I'm talking about tonight, family of origin, messages, beliefs, roles, shoulds and shouldn'ts, right? Feelings, how to express them, deal with them, cope with them. We start to do all of that in a safe context. And then those problematic behaviors become far less compelling. If we work on the do's, the don'ts become far less compelling. And then because addicts will tell you, right? Whether it's addicted to gambling or sex or drugs or alcohol or cutting or chaotic relationships, addicts will tell you that no matter how much therapy, no matter how much they look at their mother and their father, right, their family of origin, they're still compelled to use drugs or whatever maladaptive behavior there is. Then you know you need a 12-step program, an abstinence-based program, right? You need a daily program. So you work on the stuff that's underneath it all. You work on the trauma. That's the new trend. We've been talking about it for 25 years, but you work on the trauma that underlies the patterns that we're talking about, the behaviors we're talking about. You work on it courageously and honestly. And then the addictive behaviors become less compelling. But if you still find yourself compelled, you're probably going to need a 12-step program. You're probably going to need, in many cases, an abstinence-based program. Can't do abstinence necessarily with food disorders, or you wouldn't want to do it with sex, for example, but a 12-step program that works on a daily program. Because no matter how you feel, no matter how you're sorted out, you're compelled to use obsessively. Multi-generational transmission, folks, it's obvious. It's obvious as day that the things that happen in one generation carry on to the next and to the next. Those of you might have Holocaust survivors in your background, and you know what I'm talking about. The African-American population who have slaves in their background, it doesn't matter if it's been several generations, those things are passed on, right? And there are far less dramatic and broad kinds of traumatic experiences out there than just those: sexual abuse, physical abuse, emotional abuse, neglect. Those things get passed on, and we can see it. We can see it. Like I said, we at least develop, we pass on the patterns of similar levels of differentiation and self, right? That emotional proximity. We pass on the conscious and the automatic responses, like Dr. Dayton talked about. Children don't become who we tell them to be. By the way, if children became who we tell them to be, I wouldn't have a job. Evoke wouldn't exist, right? A lot of times, a lot of us, many of us, we run away from examples in our family of origin, but that does no good without awareness, without a tremendous amount of work, because you run away from that context, and guess what kind of context you're going to fit into? A very similar context, right? In moments of my life and difficulty of my marriage, I've come to learn and experience that it doesn't matter how many divorces I get, I am going to marry essentially the same person unless I do my work. So I might as well do it in my marriage, working on it in my marriage. Learning to forgive yourself mostly. Learning to work through what it takes to forgive your parents. Let me be clear. You can't forgive your parents if you've never acknowledged the hurt and the trauma and the pain and the anger that you felt toward them. So I'm not saying this Pollyannish forgiveness. I'm saying you work through the process. You identify how you've been hurt, where they've came up short. And through a much deeper process than kind of a whitewash of your history, you learn to forgive on your terms. I talked about the idea of selecting mates. That goes for friends. That goes for the children that we raise with similar levels of differentiation. Increasing levels of marital stability, health, occupational success, societal contributions, and less chaotic relationships. That can happen naturally in systems, right? We can have increasing, each generation can make improvements. That's the work. That's what you're hoping for. That's why your children are here. That's why I have a large list of parents on the broadcast this evening, live, a very large list, because you are willing to take a look at it. And again, for those of you who have had a taste of the work that I talk about, you don't need any convincing. You know exactly what I'm talking about. Those of you that might be new or might feel like it's strange, confusing, or counterintuitive, stick with it. It is a liberating and empowering and freeing experience to do this work. Challenging your family of origin. Oh, this is a story. This I actually learned this was a story given to me by my first family systems professor as an undergraduate, probably my sophomore year in college. He tells this story. He said that, I don't know if it was his story, I don't know if it's a hypothetical story, but I'll tell it as if it's his story because I think that's the way that he told it to us. So anyway, he's a newly married to his wife, and she cooks the roast beef for him. And he loves roast beef. This is one of his favorite things. And special evening, his wife likes to cook. She cooks a roast beef. And she cuts the ends of it off. And when the roast beef comes out and he's about ready to eat, he looks and he says, "Where's the ends of the roast beef? I really loved the crispy ends. That was my favorite part." And she says, "That's just the way we cook it in our family. We cut off the ends." So she goes to her mother and she says, "Why do we cut off the ends of the roast beef? My new husband loves them, and I cut off the ends." And he asked, "Why? Is there a reason?" And she says, "That's just the way that my mother did it." So she goes to her grandmother. And she says, "Grandma, why did you cut the ends off the roast beef?" And she said, "Well, when I was younger, years and years and years ago, my oven was small, my pan was small. It wouldn't fit the entire roast beef, so I would just cut the ends off of it to make room." And this story, whether it's hypothetical or not, can illustrate very easily what we do in our families, right? We just do what was done before, sometimes without even questioning. And we do things that don't make sense, right? That's what all of this awareness creating is about. That's why we're here to teach your children how to feel. And I'm sorry to tell you, but you're going to be one of the first targets. Meaning that that's the first rock that we're going to look under when we're looking for problems. So we empathically, lovingly, hopefully supportively want to hold you while you learn to hear some uncomfortable things from your child. And we believe, and it is our experience, and it is the experience of therapists all across the world, that is the doorway to freedom for all of you. So if you can do it and sit with it, do it yourself. Do your own family of origin work. Come to an intensive. Like I say, there's nothing that I think you could do more to help your child. Nothing. Nothing in terms of time and money and emotional resources that you could do more to help your child than to go to your own intensive. And then you come away with something that's worth more than all the psychoeducation in the world. The more covert the messages, the ideas, the feelings, the more likely they are to be passed on to the next generation. The more talked about, the more overt, the less likely. Codependency and addiction, right? That connection between the two is passed on. Like I talked about, emotional reactivity and dependency. Mood disorders. See, there are styles. What diagnoses are styles. They are patterns of coping. We have depressed patterns. We have anxious patterns, and those are kind of cousins to each other. We have substance abuse disorder patterns. All right? We have rage and reactivity in relationship patterns. Those are the kinds of patterns that we pass on. And even though we might say our family growing up was pretty good and mild, it's just a seed. It's just a seed. And believe me, the culture, the peers, the teachers, the media, they will water that seed and it will fully bloom in your child. Communication patterns, empathy. Empathy, remembering means maintaining a self. Those will get patterned. Rules about time, money, and roles will get passed on. Competition and cooperation paradigms will get passed on. My first professor in graduate school, I told you about an early professor in undergraduate school. My very first professor in graduate school, Dr. Barbara Lynch, said in one of my first classes, she said, "We replicate to repair." We will keep repeating patterns in our lives that are self-destructive, that come from our family of origin until we repair them. We recreate our old relationships and patterns in order to understand and heal ourselves. It feels natural and comfortable to us. It's the only way we know to meet our seemingly unmeetable needs. We recreate the same scripts in our current relationships until they lose their shine, until they become uninteresting, until we have the ability to walk away from them. That takes a long time. And when they become healed, when old wounds become healed, those old kinds of relationships that look like old patterns become very uninteresting to us. And it's not emotional cutoff, right? It's not running away. I love this poem by Portia Nelson. I'm going to read it to you for those listening. For those watching, you can follow along with me. If you want to Google it, if you're listening on the podcast app, Google Portia Nelson, and the title is Autobiography in 5 Short Chapters. Chapter 1. I walk down the street. There is a deep hole in the sidewalk. I fall in. I am lost. I am hopeless. It isn't my fault. It takes forever to find a way out. Chapter 2. I walk down the same street. There's a deep hole in the sidewalk. I pretend I don't see it. I fall in again. I can't believe I am in the same place, but it isn't my fault. It still takes a long time to get out. Chapter 3. I walk down the same street. There's a deep hole in the sidewalk. I see it there. I still fall in. It's a habit, but my eyes are open. I know where I am. It's my fault, and I get out immediately. Chapter 4. I walk down the same street. There's a deep hole in the sidewalk, and I walk around it. And chapter 5, I walk down another street. Walking down another street as step 1 is terrifying. And it is the thing that clients, not just adult clients, but adolescent clients, always tell me that they're going to do. I promise you, Brad, I will walk down a different street. I promise you I won't use again. I promise my parents. I have enough willpower. I have enough resolve. The consequences are severe enough. I won't walk down that street again and fall into the pit of addiction or rage or whatever it is. I promise you. And unfortunately, it doesn't work that way. You have to do deep and meaningful step-by-step work. You have to heal things that are terrifying to confront. You have to let go of old things, old ideas, old messages. You have to shed off guilt and shame, no matter how entrenched they are in you. You have to do all of that. And eventually, you're capable of walking down another street. But not just because of resolve and willpower. It has to be, it's like, it doesn't matter how much willpower you have. If you're not in shape, you can't run a marathon or an Ironman triathlon. It doesn't matter. If you're not in shape, you can't do it. It doesn't matter. It doesn't matter if your life or the life of a loved one depend on it. You cannot swim 2.5 miles, ride your bike 112 miles, and run 26 miles. It won't work. The course will be closed in the 17.5 hours that they allow for it, and you will fail. So it takes daily work. It takes practice. It takes a coach often. It takes a plan. It takes pain. It takes a lonely Tuesday morning in the rain on the track. That's where the race is won. So what are the take-homes? Try not to take yourself too seriously. Let go of this idea that things had to be perfect in your childhood and that everything was perfect and your parents were perfect. And just start to look at yourself and your family as human. Start to understand your own limitations. And realize that often you cannot win. This is important. I think this is a mantra that if we all adopted, we would take one giant step forward on the differentiation scale. You cannot win. You can only choose how to lose. Learn to take care of yourself and admit that you're doing it. An ironic step for parents is that they need to learn to take care of themselves. Because if you don't, your child will try to, and you will allow them to. They will try to show up cooperative enough, good enough, successful enough, well-behaved enough. They will try it so that you feel okay and you can sleep at night. Until you start practicing not medication, although that might help. Until you practice meditation or yoga or self-care or therapy, right? And then when you take care of yourself, you can be there as a resource for your child. So take care of yourself and admit that you need it and that you're doing it. Don't use shame and guilt as behavioral techniques. Shame, fear, and guilt, they are fantastic behavioral techniques in the short run. They happen to ruin an individual's self, but in the short term, they are very, very effective. That's why we use them. That's why I use them. Forgive your parents, but first, learn to get mad at them, to understand their shortcomings and to process it, and then forgive them. Learn to practice I statements. I feel, I think, I want, I believe, instead of you statements. Learn to take responsibility for your own serenity. See, here's the deal. If you're unhappy, that's your problem. If you're sad or scared, that's a you problem. Now, I'm a father, and so I know the suffering of my children. There is no greater trigger to my suffering. I know that. I'm not saying in some kind of cold robotic way, but at a fundamental level, my serenity is my responsibility. Your serenity is your responsibility. And if you or I hand that responsibility for my serenity, for your serenity, over to the child, saying to them, you need to stop using drugs or cutting on yourself, whatever it is, so that I can sleep at night. If you do that, it'll ruin them. So you take care of yourself. Learn to practice I statements in order to increase your own awareness, your own intrapsychic differentiation, that is knowing what's going on inside of you, and interpersonal differentiation, which means the boundaries, the emotional proximities between you and the people that you love. I put this on here because I think it's related. I think this is a fantastic, fantastic YouTube talk. It's by Johan Hari, Johanhari, Johan Hari. The title of it is Everything You Know About Addiction is Wrong. And again, if your child doesn't have an addiction or a substance abuse disorder, just substitute any disorder that they have, because they all come back to this same thing. So Google that. I've drawn the link here on the webinar if you're watching. So go and watch that 14-minute video, and I want you to watch it with this question in mind. What are the implications for parenting a struggling child? What are the implications in that video for supporting a child who is struggling? And the cheat answer is that the opposite of addiction is not sobriety, it is connection. That's what everybody's seeking. And if you develop a strong enough and clear enough base to be an adequate enough, I'll call it a container, right? Being able to hold a space for somebody else. If you develop enough capacity because you've sorted out your wounds and your anxiety and therapy, that you can become an adequate container for somebody else, for your child, ideally. That means that what they say and do doesn't freak you out, doesn't panic you, doesn't upset you or disappoint you to the point of all of that spilling over onto them. If you can do that, you begin to be a part of the solution. You begin to be the antidote to what vexes them. And I'll say this last thing before I open it up for questions. That does not, that developing yourself as an adequate container does not exclude you having a healthy self with healthy boundaries. In fact, it's necessary. It's built upon that, because if you don't have that, you're not containing somebody, you're fusing with them. You're becoming them. And you'll become more dependent upon them. All right, I'm happy to take any questions that have come in. First question that comes in: how do we, parents, access our child's unfelt emotional world? How do we bridge perception, belief, attitude? Is it just empathy or modeling or carrying a message? Great question. Asking and listening and tolerating nonsense. I was sharing with somebody recently that last summer when I was in family therapy with my now 17-year-old son, last year he was 16, that the story he was telling in therapy, I was thinking to myself, not only do I think parts of this are inaccurate, I don't even think he believes it. I think he's making it up. I really believe that. I think he's just playing the role. And when I had that thought, I looked at the therapist. I looked at his therapist and something hit me. I thought, wait a second, when I'm the therapist, I don't believe what the person is saying verbatim, right? I don't believe it literally. I listen to the emotional world of the client sharing the experience. And I don't draw lines around the facts. It doesn't matter to me. It's almost as if your child is telling you a dream. So the answer to the question is ask for their impact letter. Invite their impact letter to you. The impact letter is a letter that they write to parents that say, this is what you did that hurt me. And listen to it even if you think it's wrong, inaccurate, exaggerative. And people worry, well, they're going to hold that against me. They're going to blame. I will tell you guys this. They can't use it against you if you're differentiated. On my most differentiated days and moments, any of my children could walk through my office door and tell me what a horrible, rotten father I am. And if I'm in a good place and grounded, my response is, I'm sorry. You're kind of right. But nothing about accountability gets compromised in my listening or my empathy. I want you to be clear about that. When the child tells you how horrible you are as a dad or a mother, your response is, you don't even know the half of it. You know, if you knew everything, you'd be talking more about that too. But that doesn't rob you of your right as a sovereign self to say, here's my boundary. Here's what I will and won't tolerate. What does happen is you don't get to be right anymore. Your high horse is dead. You don't get to be right or good anymore. You just get to be a person. And that is so much better, so much more solid, so much more consistent. It has boundaries and limits. No is a complete sentence, but it has much, much more empathy and love to it. How far back does another parent asks, how far back does the family of origin extend? Is there a spiritual burden of the weight of history set against the backdrop of war, famine, servitude, and abuse? I think so. I don't know what we can do about all of that except for enter it into our minds as a point of empathy. But yeah, when I look at the children and grandchildren of somebody who was in a concentration camp in Nazi Germany, I can see it. Gabor Mate, Dr. Gabor Mate, the Hungarian psychologist who talks about this as much as anybody, in the realm of hungry ghosts, is one of his books. He can tell you about that, about being the son of somebody who survived the Holocaust. Absolutely. Somebody who grew up in the inner city, right? The African American legacy in this country, it's pretty apparent. The lack of capacity for attachment from a child who grew up in a traumatic setting, you can see it in their eyes, literally. And I'm not saying that metaphorically. You can see the blank stare in their eyes. I watched a mother at the airport after really studying a lot of attachment research, and I watched a mother in an airport one time play with her child, and she had all kinds of toys laid out for him. He looked like he was around 4 or 5, and it was a young mother. And the look on her face was a blank stare, oftentimes looking down at her cell phone, and she was lifeless. And she was trying to give her children, her child, her boy, some stimulation, right? She wasn't making no effort, but she had so little to give. And what I knew about her is that there was an enormous, massive reservoir of trauma that has been unprocessed and unhealed. I could see it in the blank stare in her eyes and in the staring down at her cell phone and in her inability to see her child and the resulting sparkle that would come into his eyes if she could see him. So yeah, the legacy is multi-generational. With an unending history, how do we parents find the wound in our family of origin? Therapy, CODA, Families Anonymous, adult children of alcoholics. I love adult children of alcoholics. Even if your parents weren't traditional alcoholics, even if they used very little to no alcohol, You can start to hear the messages that many of us received in our families of origin. For me, and I sell this because I believe in it, an intensive is a great dive into this, right? I did it myself. I do one every year. My adult children have done one. My wife has done one. I've done one with my wife. My 11-year-old just attended her first session of one just this last week. I believe in them. We send our therapists and our administrators in our program to another company to do this. All of this is something we pay out of pocket. It's not our program. Now we have one, right? Our Finding You. In fact, we have Finding You next Thursday or next Wednesday is our next Finding You, and we still have a spot. If you can do it, go. It is the best dive into this work. And I don't know how to say this because I've been saying stuff like this for 20 years. It's what everybody would tell you if they could, if they thought you would listen. Luckily, I'm on a broadcast, so I'm not sitting across from you, but I'll speak to the audience in general. And by the way, there are several people on this list who have done it. Some of them have done more than one. Okay? It's the biggest difference you can make. I'm confident of that. So that's how. Another parent says, our son just completed Evoke Wilderness Program and went to a boarding school. He made nice progress. My question is on the effectiveness of wilderness therapeutic programs in general. Considering the very high price of wilderness programs, only the rich and educated part of society can afford such therapy for their kids. This means that the kids coming to these wilderness programs are from families that are on average more aware and more educated about health issues, also more able to support kids after the wilderness program. Thus, I am not sure how to view any statistical evidence for the effectiveness of these programs, as I am not sure there would be a good control group. Do you have any thoughts on how to properly estimate effectiveness of wilderness programs? Great question. On our website, we have at Evoke the most preeminent researcher in wilderness therapy in the United States, Dr. Matt Hoig. He helped develop the YOQ when he was in graduate school with his professors, which is a measure of anybody in therapy. So that's taken from populations across the United States in all kinds of settings. So we use the YOQ. And we have several long-term studies that study clients going through our program and then 2 years afterwards. So the research is there. So the important thing to understand is that the control group, when you're using statistical measures of mental health and mental health progress, are in the measure themselves. The MMPI, one of the most famous measures, it's been normed across the United States on the entire population. So you compare it to them to see how effective it is. And our research at Evoke shows us to be 30% more effective than the industry average. I believe it's because of the parent work. I believe it's because of the primitive living. I have a podcast on that. I really do believe it. So you can compare it industry, you can compare it to people in what they call the community sample or outpatient therapy. Most of all, you experience it, right? Most of all, you experience the change in yourself and your child. And it's not just for rich people. You know, we put through several people a year who can't afford it. Our Alumni Scholarship Foundation has put through several people who have no ability to pay anything for this. So we're always trying to raise money to support people who can't afford it at all. So you're right that by and large, the majority of our clients are middle to upper class, but there are opportunities for those who can't afford it. So that's a part of it too. And the another piece that I'd refer you to, in fact, I did a broadcast on it, is read the book, Price of Privilege. Read the book, The Price of Privilege, or listen to the podcast, Price of Privilege by Madeline Levine. And Dr. Levine is very clear, because she works in an upper middle class population, that the problems that are affecting our well-to-do or affluent children in this country are life-threatening. The suicide rates among the middle and upper class are raising at higher rates than the lower class. So why we might on the surface have all of those things you described, I do not think we are immune. In fact, I think There's a special brand of mental illness that is gripping the middle and upper class that needs our attention. Here is a parent making a comment. This is an unsolicited opinion. I have been to Finding You 1 and Finding You 2. That's the, if you've been to Finding You 1, you can come to Finding You 2. I have been to Finding You 1 and Finding You 2. To the newer parents here, please know this is life-changing. It has been for me, and learning how to make, and I'm learning how to make the changes I need to be a happier, healthier person, and how to be a healthier parent. It really is valuable, I promise. Yeah, it's one of those things that once you do it, you see it. But gosh, it's so frightening to step into your own work, to identify yourself as the patient. All right, let me go over some upcoming announcements, and then you can submit any questions. I will be in Los Angeles. We have a couple of spots left in Los Angeles. So if you want to join our parent support group this Sunday, August 11th, 4 to 7 p.m., please email Melanie at evoketherapy.com. I'll be in New York City on September 9th. That's 7 to 9 p.m. Monday evening. And in Chicago on September 17th, 7 to 9 p.m., RSVP to Melanie at evoketherapy.com. So let us know if you're coming. It helps for space. And at the LA one, we only have a couple of spaces left. And I'll be out there for all of those. If you want to do this deep dive, like I said, we have a couple of spaces left in our August 14th through 18th group. So you're welcome to join. The next one after that will be September 18th through 22nd, and then October 23rd through 27th, and November 13th through 17th. If you want to have an outdoor adventure with your child or by yourself, pursuit trips are available also for young adults or even adolescents. We ask all parents to go to 6 12-step support groups. These are free. Al-Anon, CODA, Families Anonymous, and adultchildren.org are all places you can go to find meetings and schedule in your area. Alateen is for teenagers. So if you have somebody in the family that's a teenager that wants support, they can go there. Refugerecovery.org is a support group for people that maybe have more of a Buddhist mentality, non-higher power focused. And then NAMI.org has classes and resources in your area. All of these broadcasts are available on the podcast app on an iPhone or an Android device. Download your favorite podcast app and find them there, or go to soundcloud.com on your computer. On Twitter and Instagram, you can find Evoke Therapy by using the handle at Evoke Therapy, or you can find our intensive page on Instagram by using the handle at Evoke Summit Lodge. On Facebook, you can find us by searching Evoke Therapy Programs, or the Alumni Foundation that I talked about a couple of moments ago. They raise money for people who can't afford therapy. That's called the Evoke Family Foundation. You can find information there, And the Evoke blog, of course, on our website is available. My book, The Journey of the Heroic Parent, is available on Amazon. If you go through the Evoke Family Foundation, the Evoke Alumni Foundation page, part of your proceeds of any book that you buy go to help people that can't afford therapy. Any other comments or questions before I wrap up, Lindsay? Another parent says, why can't we just grieve, let go of the wounds, and focus on the positive accomplishments of the family of origin? You can. That's the idea. That's exactly what I'm asking you to do, is grieve it. But grieve it doesn't mean you don't feel it. It means you make it explicit. You know, to heal a wound, you can't just bandage it up. You have to clean it out. You have to see if there's an infection. Sometimes you have to take an antibiotic or dress the wounds. So yeah, that is what it is. It's grieving, processing it so you can move on. I know the impulse, though, just to want to focus on the happy. I get it. Anything else before we close? All right, looks like that's all. I don't have the next, I'll put this out tomorrow. I don't have the next date and time and subject for our next broadcast. I'm always open to suggestions or readings from you all. Thank you for joining us on behalf of your children. For the people that show up, which was a very large group tonight, thank you for showing up and being willing to think about or look at these things. It'll make a big difference to your child, make a big difference to your child in their healing. So I hope this point of contact is helpful. Have a great evening, and I'll talk to you next time. Bye-bye.